Hello, and welcome to Tackling Ransomware with Proven Mitigation Strategies. Today's webinar is sponsored by ReliaQuest and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. The Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues. But if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I especially want to call your attention to the top item in the list there. It's a PDF of a 2-page ReliaQuest solution brief on threat intelligence. Also in that section, there's a link to the Guerrilla Guide Book Club where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can also be found in your handout section. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenter. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. So at the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It is my pleasure to welcome our presenter today, Jonathan Echevarria, who's an enterprise architect with ReliaQuest.
Thanks,
Jonathan.
Scott.
Welcome to the webinar. Thanks for
Scott.
being here.
How are you?
Take it away. Great.
Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about how to tackle ransomware with proven mitigation strategies. What we're going to focus on is ways to mitigate ransomware, essentially, and things that you can implement within your own environment starting today. Hopefully, it can help you reduce a lot of the risk associated with ransomware within your environments. So this is our safe harbor statement regarding this presentation. I'll leave it up for a second for you to read it. Okay, so to start, we're going to go over 2 core keys that I like to talk about when it comes to mitigating ransomware, right? And ultimately, I'll start with the best solution. And the best solution is defense in depth to tackle ransomware within your environment, right? But there's 2 key concepts to it. And the first is preparedness, which kind of measures how quick you can recover from an infection with minimal downtime. And then the other key concept is mitigation. And it's a measure of your ability to prevent and detect an infection in the first place. So as the operators within your enterprise, pay close attention to both being prepared, as in I can quickly recover from ransomware, and being able to mitigate it, as in I can quickly detect what's happening within my environment. Now, to help you with preparedness, we're going to talk a little bit about backups, as that's the best strategy that you can implement. There's a few key tenets to when we start talking about backups, right? And the core thing is I really like to focus on ensuring that they are audited and segmented. Audited, I mean, you should know whenever anyone touches the backup. You should know the file hashes of every file that goes into the backup. Verify that those are correct, right? You should air gap your backups and make sure that you can't reach them, no one can reach them, or that you need a separate set of credentials in order to be able to reach them. Your domain administrator accounts should not be the ones that have access to the backups, right? Like those are going to be your key targeted accounts. So ensuring that there's a degree of separation as far as authority goes with the backups is absolutely critical. you should, within the backups, maintain a gold image of your critical systems, right? That's going to help you from a preparedness standpoint. And in the event that you have to recover from a ransomware incident, you can quickly boost what's going on. So as far as to quickly touch on air gapping, right? Like what I mean by that is a physical segmentation of a host or backup from the rest of your environment. So to kind of give an example, that's going to be something like you have your standard domain here, right? The other domain is going to have a set of accounts that's going to access the actual backups themselves. So you have separate sets of credentials and separate sets of network segments as far as like air gapping your backup and your environment system. You should maintain redundant backup hardware as well. And what I mean by that is, and this is typically like an IT strategy anyways. You know, they talk about high availability clustering. You typically will have, firewalls in a high availability way. In the event that the hardware itself goes out, you could just rip the servers out or rip the network equipment out, place your new redundant systems in, and you'll be ready to go in the event of a compromise. But going back to the concept of air gapping, as you implement these strategies, you should consider how attackers can reach the actual backups themselves, right? Like place a lot of focus from the strategy perspective on the attack paths that an attacker can use in order to reach your backup systems, as those are the ultimate final step that's going to ensure that your environment can quickly recover from an incident. And finally, consider segmenting account access to backups, different accounts, different passwords. Make sure that everything is all separate and segmented. So the core thing that I like to talk about when really discussing any offensive security thing, not just ransomware, is you should always assume breach. You are not special. You are not immune. Your tools will not save you. Don't let your ego make you a victim. If you assume breach, you will never be surprised. And you can do this by thinking about every single phase of the infection. Look at your network from an adversarial standpoint and consider what would I want as an attacker? What would I want to do? A good strategy for doing this is I always recommend doing tabletops with your internal security teams, right? Like everyone, and bring IT into it. Partner with other teams that are involved with running IT operations. Because the key concept there is everyone has a completely different perspective on what the definition of your environment is, what you can see, what you're interacting with. And by doing tabletop engagements, you can get a lot of those different perspectives that your security team might not be aware of. Your network engineering team might not be aware of. DevOps might not be aware of. Finally, I recommend having a playbook for incidents and doing regular exercises, right? So you should focus on making strategies in order to account for when an incident actually happens. The other key component of assuming breach is that you should know what your environmental baseline is. And what I mean by that is you should know what's happening within your environment, know what's considered normal, and you'll be able to quickly identify abnormalities within your environment. You can start slow with baselining. This is not something that you can get to overnight. And a key part of this is security controls themselves, right? Like you want to ensure that you get as much network visibility as possible. You want to ensure you get as much endpoint visibility as possible. Are you collecting process execution logs? Do you know when someone's logged in? Do you know what's considered a normal login region for someone? And what I mean by that is like, okay, I have Jim in accounting, and Jim in accounting always logs in from the Virginia area, right? Now, if Jim in accounting suddenly logs in from Moscow, I should be able to identify that, and that is an abnormality from the baseline of my environment. So the first strategy that we're going to talk about, and we're going to touch on some vectors for ransomware access actors, right? My suggestion is to prioritize them in the order that I present them to you. And coming in first is initial access. And everyone's favorite is phishing, right? Counter to what you believe, I'm not going to tell you to do regular phishing exercises. I'm not going to tell you phish your workforce. I understand that's in pretty much every prevention guide, but if I'm being completely honest, in my experience, their effectiveness is kind of limited, and it's pretty counter to the principle of assumed breach, right? The most important thing you can do to make it harder for an attacker to use credentials that have been phished in the first place. There's the ways to help prevent that. You should be training your user to be aware of what phishing emails look like, but regularly phishing them just makes everyone's life harder, including attackers. Putting an email gateway in does make it harder to land a phish, but regularly review the incoming emails and put a process in place that makes the phishing easy to be reported and can give you an idea of the types of threats that you're facing on a day-to-day basis, right? One of the ways that you can harden the credentials of your users is preventing things from credential reuse. Some strategies for that are the ultimate one is ensuring that you are enforcing multi-factor authentication. When it comes to MFA, there's really four basic types of MFA, right? There's hardware token, there's code-based being, like the Google Authenticator app installs a time-based code that rotates every 60 seconds or so. There's push-based authentication, as you might see with Duo, and then there's SMS-based authentication. Hardware tokens are absolutely the best, but most people, that's kind of out of their budget. I always recommend going code-based authentication, like multi-factor authentication over push or SMS. SMS has some risks associated with it, but it is absolutely better than nothing. The other thing to focus on is like ensuring that you're securing your insecure external infrastructure. The best way to do that is to regularly audit what's externally facing. Scan your external IP range, just open up a server in DigitalOcean, open up a server in AWS, install Nmap and just scan everything. Do vuln scans against yourself, right? Like you should have an idea of what's exposed to the internet, because those are the things that attackers are going to target. And then the last vector is third-party access. And what I mean by that is consider the access that you're granting to third parties. So that could be external contractors. That could be vendors that you have a site-to-site peering with. There was an incident a couple of years ago where they ransomwared a company by coming in through the AC contractor that they had a site-to-site VPN with. And the ransomware actors first breached the AC contractor. They utilized that site-to-site VPN in order to get to this company and launch the ransomware, right? So even if they were protecting their phishing, even if they were securing their external infrastructure, they didn't take into consideration the security risks associated with, if my partners are compromised, how could that be leveraged against my environment? So the next thing that we're going to talk about is lateral movement, right? And this is really focusing, again, taking the concept of assumed breach in mind, what an attacker can do once they are on the box, not if they are on the box, because you should assume that an attacker is going to get on the box anyways. But before we start about that, let's touch lightly on actor sophistication, right? And I'm going to group ransomware actors into two buckets, if you will. The first are your low sophistication, unskilled threat actors, right? Some key features that I see with them typically is that they'll bring their own tooling. But usually, and this is the importance of having network visibility controls, they're going to do things like downloading them from GitHub. LapSUS was a group that did some of these things. And a lot of the common indicators that they see is, okay, they get a shell on the box, right? Now they've landed on a user's machine, but they start downloading all of their tooling directly from GitHub. Well, if you're logging for that, you'll be able to see it. Typically, and groups like Conti do this a lot, they'll also use external services. So Conti is one of their biggest tricks is to use rclone with Mega and Z to exfiltrate data before encryption. And that way that they have some extra ammunition whenever they come asking for the ransom. And it'll typically be things like credit card numbers or customer information that they're going to use to blackmail you. So for the other bucket, right, you have your higher sophistication threat actors, and they generally change things up a little bit. One of the core tenets, right, is that they typically use what's called lull bins, or living on the land binaries. What that means is essentially, I'm not going to bring my own tooling. I'm going to use existing commands that are on the machine in order to leverage those and do whatever things that I want to do. So an example of that would be like Powershell is a massive scripting language. It's very, very powerful. And because it's an interpreter that runs commonly on every single Windows machine, ransomware actors will heavily leverage that in order to do more advanced things. I could write a network scanner in PowerShell, run it on the box, and I didn't have to go out to the internet to grab Nmap, right? But that also goes back into, the key strategy that your security team should be implementing is start thinking about, okay, do I need to have some of these like possible lull bins exist, like available for most users? An example is going back to Jim in accounting. He's probably never going to need to run PowerShell on his own machine. So, bucket those groups of users into their own OUs, assign GPOs to them that disables PowerShell, because there's really no reason that he's going to be able to need that. If you Google lull bin, there's a great website that lists out very commonly abused lull bins, and just review your environment, regularly conduct hunts, and look for usage of these, right? Like a lot of the times they're very uncommon ways of using the tools. It's just abusing features that these tools can use. So they stick out, but you can only see that if you focus on ensuring that you have these security controls that are able to log and audit the usage of these lull bins. We don't just see like WMI or SMB pivoting. And actually this goes across both actors as well, right? Like traditionally, when I say that, I'm circa 2015-14, when everyone was, only using Cobalt Strike. The only time that you would see threat actors pivot would be using like WMI or SMB. But lately, there's been a new trend of SSH proxy usage or RDP pivots. So they'll bring their own SSH applications onto the machine, and then they will proxy the connections through those SSH applications from machine to machine. Or they'll just leverage RDP itself on the machine and pivot to other boxes within your environment that way. They also typically use better payloads. There's been a lot of evolution in the offensive security space as far as doing EDR bypasses, getting around, ETW from Microsoft, getting around AMSI scanning. There's also been things like the SysWhispers tool that helps focus on using underlying kernel level APIs within Windows, which most EDRs don't typically have the ability to inspect the usage of. So that allows them to get around some of these controls. And if you think about the concept of defense in depth, right? Sure, your EDR might not be able to see that, but did you catch the initial execution of the payload itself? Did you catch the abnormal activities that are happening as a result of what they're doing on the machine? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be blind. It's just you need to have redundant security controls that are collecting different bits of information. And ultimately, the best groups are going to rely on methods that blend into your environment, right? Like when I was doing a lot of offensive security exercises and red teaming, I would sit on a box for a week, sit there and get an idea of what's normal for this environment, what's normal for this user. I'm not going to do anything, and I'm just going to get an idea of what blends in. Higher sophistication threat actors are doing that as well. So now your standard activity monitoring is something that every organization should have in play for mitigating ransomware threats. And again, the most important thing you can do with this strategy is to understand what's normal within your environment, right? Consider how users normally download files. Usually that's going to be through a web browser. Whenever they are downloading files with PowerShell, that's a bit abnormal, and that's something that your security controls should be able to see. Restrict and remove unneeded tooling. That goes back to lull bins, right? If you have to have PowerShell enabled on a machine, enable script block logging, remove old versions of PowerShell, disable functionality that isn't going to be used or doesn't have a job function need. And I always suggest regular activity hunting because it really goes a very, very long way, right? You can look at things like login activity, admin tool usage, and network behavior. One of my favorite hunts that I like to run within our environment, and you can see some of it in our gray matter hunt capability on the right here, is what I like to call the off weirdness hunt, right? And essentially what I'm looking for is, okay, I'm going to look at a list of usernames that have logged into the environment, right? Be it, say, Office 365. Office 365 authentication logs are going to collect information about that user. They're going to collect what IP address are they authenticating from, what user agents are they authenticating with, right? The user agents is really, really key here because what I like to do is look at, okay, I know this is a valid, legitimate login from this user. But whenever I see a different user agent, that kind of sticks out to me. And a lot of the time, especially for like lower sophistication actors, they aren't putting focus or effort or energy into changing some of these artifacts. And these are really simple things that stick out and can be used to catch them. So if normally you would see, oh, Mozilla Windows 10 Chrome version, blah, 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 and that would be the user's normal user agent. But then the next login is from Python-requests, and that's the user agent, then something weird is happening. And that's something that we should be able to see. One of the big things that I like to always say is that EDR is not a magic shield, right? EDR is great, right? It's typically a low friction implementation. You install an agent on all of your endpoints, and it does provide a really, really important audit trail for process execution and activity to a much deeper depth than traditional antivirus would. But I want you to walk away from this understanding that EDR is not magic. As I mentioned before, a lot of innovations in the offensive security space have helped prove this. API unhooking is a key strategy that's used by Conti. Direct syscalls, syswhispers, all of these Heaven's Gate, Hell's Gate, all of these new techniques for executing shell code and running functions in a very, very strange and abnormal manner that EDRs aren't typically catching are evolving and happening and being deployed within environments now. Consider looking at application whitelisting. I'm sorry, that says whistleblowing. This is a very high friction solution, right? But it's also a very, very effective solution. And application whitelisting is essentially having a list of applications that are known good and allowed to be run on an endpoint. This is one of the most effective strategies an organization can implement. But again, like every other strategy we discussed today, is infallible, right? It's a very difficult solution to implement. But the key is to be able to identify when an application is behaving abnormality, even if you have the applications all whitelisted. And that goes back to the lull bin usage, abuse of these legitimate applications that you've whitelisted. You can start slow with this, right? And the best way to do that is to start separating your Active Directory environment into groups, depending on job function or tooling needed. If you know that, Jim from accounting always uses QuickBooks, then okay, let's have QuickBooks on that machine, right? But there's probably no reason that he needs to have Python or PowerShell installed on that machine. My favorite thing is conducting offensive exercises, right? Like vulnerability scanning is absolutely important. But what's more important is that you should remediate your identified vulnerabilities, right? Like it's one thing to run a vuln scan and say, yes, we're protected. It's another to run a vuln scan and take actions on the vulnerabilities that are identified. I love doing offensive exercises, and I think it's absolutely valuable to any organization, right? Consider hiring out, this, get a pen test done, get a red team engagement done. That is the most realistic assessment of readiness for your organization that you could possibly get. You could start small though, right? Like do tabletops, and that's your red teaming light, and just think about things from an adversarial perspective. Next, you should regularly emulate expected ransomware activity to identify gaps within your environment, right? So outside of the red teams, outside of the vuln scanning, do things that ransomware would do. Do things that these threat actors would be doing within your environment to ensure that, yes, my controls are in place. I am watching for this sort of activity. I am able to detect when this sort of thing is happening. Understand that doing regular exercises is not necessarily the most effective solution, though. Offensive exercises are a point-in-time exercise that provide value at the time of the exercise, right? So the red team is great. This report's fantastic. It showed me all of the problems that I have, but that could change absolutely tomorrow. So doing continuous validation of your environment, using a tool like Verify, increases the overall effectiveness of your mitigations. There's other open source tools that can do some of these same sorts of things. So, look at utilizing those as well. There's Caldera. Look at like the MITRE framework for some of the actions that these operators are doing, and just replicate them within your environment to be able to determine how can we detect this sort of activity and behavior. Put some focus on network security. And the best way to do that is to ask yourself questions that allow you to limit risk, right? Great questions to ask. Do your workstations really need to talk to each other, right? Like, does accounting necessarily need to be able to talk to IT PCs? Probably not, right? Does sales PCs need to be able to reach accounting PCs? Probably not. Segment those portions of your network from each other. Do your workstations need to be able to talk on certain protocols to the internet? Best example is SMB. There's probably no reason that any internal machine should be able to talk via SMB to the internet. And if that's needed, make an exception for it, right? But audit and segment these sorts of exceptions that you're doing and do it carefully. But work on a reductive and restrictive basis when you're talking about and starting with like network segmentation and network security. Your typical network security tooling does provide a lot of additional protection. Things like your application-aware firewalls. That's going to be Palo Alto's, for example, right? They work just like a firewall, but they also analyze all of the traffic that's going through them and are able to be aware of what that traffic actually is, rather than just saying, okay, this is traffic running on port 80 and I'm going to be able to block it. No, hey, this is traffic going to Pornhub, and I'm going to be able to block all sorts of those applications, right? Other things are like your IDS. That's going to be your snorts, your suricata's, but make sure that you are regularly updating those signatures, because you should, they will get out of date. They're constantly being refreshed or constantly being added to. And it's critical that you're on the bleeding edge of the latest detections as they come out. Consider asset management, right? This is a very high friction solution, but it helps you thoroughly understand what assets your organization has. You can determine your readiness when you lose an asset. And then if you're managing your assets, you can restrict your assets to their roles to help reduce that attack surface. So the key part that I'm really trying to highlight is understand what things need to do and why they need to do it. And then if they don't need to be able to do something, they should not be able to do it, if that makes sense. I also like to talk about canaries. I really, really love canaries, as they truly are your best early warning system. They're one of the best ways to increase visibility from an assumed breach standpoint. Canary is essentially honeypot systems or tokens, such as Active Directory credentials, that appear enticing to attackers unfamiliar with your environment, but they'll alert you as soon as they're accessed. This is an excellent way to identify abnormal activity within your environment. But when you do, then consider that attackers shouldn't be able to tell when they encounter one, right? You want to make them enticing, but not necessarily too obvious. And what I mean by that is when you make a canary token, your username scheme might be first initial, last name. Okay, cool. That does not mean that the canary token should be John Smith, right? Because that falls outside of what is normal within your environment. Now, that John Smith could have all of these roles and within AD and make it really juicy and enticing for an attacker to attempt to pivot to whenever they run a tool like Bloodhound. But if you do this with intentional design, you can prevent that from being exploitable or usable from an attacker's perspective. But immediately, as soon as they access the account or as soon as they use it, it's going to pop an alert to you, the operator of the network, and you'll know far ahead of time where an attacker is and what they're doing and that they're within your environment. I like to focus on strategically placing them throughout your environment to gate an attacker's progress, right? An example of that, let's say, okay, I'm running a website that has authentication on it. That website is connected to my internal network. The authentication that's on it, I'm going to have a basic canary credential inside there for the username of admin and the password of admin. That's going to be probably the first set of credentials that any attacker tries. That's going to immediately pop off a notification and let you know, hey, an attack is in progress, right? Now, when they're on that machine, have a canary account on that machine as well that they will attempt to use the credentials for. Make it look enticing, make it look normal, make it look like a service account. But as soon as they try to use those credentials, now you know that machine has been breached before the attacker has the ability to even pivot through and within the rest of your network. There's a lot of free or low-cost solutions to implementing canaries. And one of the best out there is Think's Canary Tokens project. I believe they have a community version which allows you to generate infinite tokens for free, but they also have a commercial solution as well. So yeah, definitely explore canaries because they are a fantastic way to mitigate attackers within your environment. So the key takeaways that I want you to have, right? Start slowly and implement your changes incrementally within your environment. This is not an all or nothing thing, right? But try to do as much as you can, and no one expects you to be able to do it overnight. But start slow and start. You want to test each change's effectiveness through tabletops and simulations. We're going to put a new control in place. Okay, is it providing value, right? And you can determine that by running simulations, doing tabletops, have the network team look at this new control and say, how is this going to affect us? Hey, we can get around it this way, right? Finally, the big key to ransomware mitigation is, again, defense in depth. There is no one stop all control that's going to kill all ransomware attackers. Really focus on trying to implement as many controls within your environment as possible to give you a wider range of visibility. So with that, we'll move to Q&A.
All right, great. Yeah, and I was just trying to go through. We have so many questions here, and I'm just trying to.
Wow.
So thanks, Jonathan. It was a fantastic presentation. And for me, that attacker sophistication slide was like a course in current techniques. Really appreciate that. I also really like those concepts of wearing your own hoodie and that idea of canaries. I've heard a lot of talk about honeypots, but canaries are a really smart, sort of similar concept, but more practical and everyday.
Yeah, and they're much less friction too.
Yeah. Absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. So the first question I want to ask you here from the audience, one came from Nathan. You talked a lot about PowerShell and I forget the guy's name. It was a Jim in accounting who you picked on repeatedly through the presentation. But Nathan wants to know, how can you track the use of PowerShell, especially with SIM and tools like that?
The best way to do that is to turn on, well, first of all, audit application executions within your environment to start with, right? So that you can see and tell whenever PowerShell.exe gets launched. But then there are certain GPO keys that allow you to do what's called script block logging. And I believe you can capture output from PowerShell executions as well. And that writes it to the Windows event log, which then gets collected by the SIM, and then you'd be able to see that. Script block logging is whenever PowerShell runs a script, it's going to output the contents of that script itself into the event log, and then that's going to get shipped off to the SIEM. And then the output is obviously whenever the command runs, whatever it outputs, that's going to get captured to the SIEM. So like script block logging can be expensive from a data standpoint, right? And that's something to consider as far as, hey, how much is this going to affect our EPS to our SIEM? But it's absolutely key especially if you have the presence and proliferation of a lot of PowerShell usage within your own environment.
Okay. All right, great. Next question here comes from Peter, who's asking about, you mentioned tabletop exercises a lot. He's wondering if you have a framework or know of a good framework, for doing those.
Not really. Like, I don't know like a specific framework off the top of my head per se. I think you have to do them a few times in order to get like a really good idea of, what we need and feel out like who is providing value in that way. And I guess what I mean by that is like, are we getting value out of having this team in? And you just kind of get a feel over doing the tabletops. The best thing that I could recommend is reading this book by Micah Zenko. It's called Red Teaming, Learning to Think Like the Enemy. It's a fantastic book that, pushes these same sorts of concepts of like, do your own offensive exercises and do these tabletops. But he provides a really good, explanation of how to conduct them and how to think about them and how to start implementing them within your environment, even if you don't, and it doesn't require like a technical background. It doesn't require, knowing how to do things. It's just a matter of thinking adversarially and like how can things go bad is the ultimate question that you're trying to answer. I think it doesn't need to be so rigid necessarily.
Gotcha. Okay.
Sense.
And so that book was Micah Zenko, Learning to Think Like the Enemy.
Yeah. Red Team, Learning to Think Like the Enemy.
Red Team. Okay. Awesome. Next question from Nathan. We're looking to do some vulnerability scanning in the near future. What first steps do I need to take to get set up with those? And is that something we can do ourselves, or do we need to contract that out?
I would start with doing an inventory of your own assets, right? Like, so an example of that is going to be, I'm a hospital. I have a lot of sensitive equipment that, if it gets touched by Nmap, it's going to knock it over. I've encountered this at colleges before, where an Nmap scan killed the entire SQL database, right? Like, you should have an idea and understanding of what are these assets that exist within your environment. You probably should be very careful doing a vuln scan with. If you contract that out, it's going to be easier, right? Like, they're going to help you walk through all of those things, but that's going to be, obviously associated with an increased cost. You can absolutely do these things out, but then, do the standard workflow of, okay, I did an asset inventory. I have an understanding of what I'm going to do. I'm going to make my own custom scanning policies, and I'm going to apply them to my asset groups, right? And like, okay, when we reach this group of assets, run this lower intensity vulnerability scanning, but when we reach these ones, run these higher intensity ones.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's what I start.
Yep. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Next question comes from Vrej, who's asking, what does Reliaquest do specifically? Do you implement an existing solution or provide customized ones?
Yeah, so we do. We have an XDR product called Gray Matter, right? Gray Matter is the single pane of glass view for all of the security tooling within your environment that it integrates with, right? We can use your existing SIEM. We can use your existing EDR. We can use, your like Office 365 and integrate a lot of those. The big key that I like to say here, and why I think like this is so valuable, is that, okay, I have signs of activity that's happening within my Windows event logs. Those Windows event logs are going straight to your SIEM, right? But you're probably not ingesting your EDR logs into your SIEM. Your EDR logs are logs that are associated with that same activity and that same malicious behavior. And, the same thing that's happening, but they're segmented in two different tools. So if you have them both brought into a single tool that's able to provide you that context, and it's just another log item that you can, do queries on and measure against, then it's much more effective from an investigation standpoint. There's a number of other features, like, I talked a little bit about gray matter verify, which helps you do these continuous attack simulations, if you will, right? Which are just point in time exercises to make sure, yes, okay, run a PowerShell script attack, and then go and check within your, did it open a ticket? Did the control catch it, right? Like, is the alerting working? And then we also have our managed SOC services where, we can integrate with your security team and help, with security engineering, security analysis, and help reduce a lot of the workload from that perspective.
Okay, great. And Paul has a question. Does ReliaQuest also provide consulting, training, or extended support in addition to the XDR platform?
Yes, we do. We do provide training, absolutely. And I know we've provided training on SIMs themselves, but most of the time the training is focused heavily on gray matter and how to do that within how to use it most effectively within your own environment.
Okay. All right, super. Another ReliaQuest question here from Matt, who's wondering, you talked a lot about ransomware, and he's wondering, can ReliaQuest provide any post-ransomware incident analysis data? What kind of forensic data can it provide, or what platforms might work well in conjunction with ReliaQuest for forensic analysis?
We provide forensic analysis. Typically, most of the investigative security tooling is going to be pre-breach, right? Because if you got really screwed in a ransomware event, right? Like you're not going to be getting logs to your SIM effectively anymore. And your systems are compromised, and you should be operating from a compromised state. At that point, you're looking more at traditional forensic tools like Encase, taking cold images of the machines themselves in order to look at okay, what did the attacker do? Now, the great thing about a tool like Gray Matter is that, yeah, we can go into the SIM and pull those logs out and conduct the investigation and conduct the hunt, looking for some of this activity because those records are already in. But after the fact, doing forensic analysis of the endpoint itself, we don't currently provide.
Okay. All right, super. So there was another question about, going back to the tabletop exercises, and I'm sure this has a consultant's answer as well. But Eileen is wondering, how frequent should tabletop exercises be performed?
That's an interesting question. And the cheap answer that I want to give you is that it really depends on how your team is structured and how almost agile your team is, I guess, right? The snarky person inside me wants to say, "Oh, do them all the time," right? Do them every single day. But that's completely unrealistic. If I had to prescribe a cadence, once a quarter would be amazing, right? Really large tabletop events that are multiple teams and you're bringing all of these different resources in. Once a quarter would be fantastic. Twice a year would be awesome, right? But I do recommend not just focusing and when you think of tabletop exercises, don't think that means every exercise has to be cross-functional and have to bring all these teams in, right? It could just be, hey, let's just bring the security team in and we'll just do a quick 30-minute tabletop on, hey, what could go wrong with this system? Right. The key is to think adversarially and just ask what could go wrong. And it's more if you can enforce that mindset within your operations itself and make it a core tenet of that, that provides just as much value, in my opinion.
Those are great points. I mean, especially, when you're talking about the cross teams, I mean, that's a lot of, the company's firepower in that room, spent on that might be all the way up to the CEO, in some examples. So you can't run them that often. What about, when you talked about like doing that abbreviated one, when it comes to a full tabletop exercise, like how much time, is ideal to sort of set aside for that?
Typically I've seen them go about like 3 hours maybe, right? And bring lunch in and just do a whole session, but I avoid making it, just focus on slides or whatever, right? Like the slides should just be up there to keep people talking about what they're doing. But I love it to see, people not yelling at each other like aggressively, but just like yelling passionately about what the security of their systems and like, well, what if this happens? And then the lawyer is thinking like, well, okay, we would handle it this way. And then finance comes in and says, well, that would affect this, right? And a lot of the times it helps you discover these sorts of like skeletons in the closet, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great.
But yeah, for 3 hours, I think it's a good time.
3 hours. All right. Super.
Yeah.
So we had a question from Matt, and it has to do with, let's say you already have malicious code within your backup. You don't necessarily even know if you do. At what point do you check for malicious code, before or after you do the backup?
So that's a great question. In my opinion, one of the best ways to do that is that you should already have checks in place for malicious code entries happening during your like normal application security review practices. So when you create a backup, you should also be verifying that with the file hashes, right? Like as data gets written, as files get written to the backup, okay, I measured that it's this hash, and then I measured that it's written as this hash on the backup itself, right? Once the backup is created, you verify all the hashes, but you should then lock the archive and prevent additional changes to it, which mitigates the risk of malicious entries thus being written to the backup, right? Since you took a record of the file hashes, you should be storing that record in a secure manner, again, air-gapped and segmented from your backup and backup process. And then when you do the backup, you should take that list and verify the files you're backing up match the source of truth that you stored the original hashes in. I suppose you're technically checking both before and after in this manner, but realistically, it's better to spend efforts focusing on ensuring that malicious code entries can't happen at all, and making your backups immutable. Because like there should not be a reason after the backup is written and verified that you could then add additional things to the archive. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes a lot of sense. Perfect. I had one more backup question, and this is kind of similar to the tabletop. Peter's asking, how often should backups be recovered? Just to provide confidence that recovery is possible. And there's a follow-up. I'll let you answer that one first, and then go to the follow-up after that.
Regularly test your backups, right? Like Netflix had this idea that they presented a few years ago. It was called Chaos Monkey. And what they do is essentially it's a piece of code that runs in production and just shuts systems down, right? Fantastic. Run that constantly, or do those sorts of things, because you should be ensuring that your backups work, right? It's one thing to take the backup, but like if the backup doesn't work and you don't know that, then it doesn't really help you. So yeah, I say test them, every 90 days, test them every 60 days, right? Like just ensure that they work.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's an example of the a great code name. You never forget Chaos Monkey. So Peter's follow-up question is, should any test recoveries, and this is related to the Netflix example, be performed in production, or is it recommended this be done periodically in a separate DR environment? How do you balance that? Because you don't want to run Chaos Monkey and have your business go down just because you're doing a test. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, so counterpoint, right? Like that's if that happens, then you've identified a problem, right? And like you wouldn't have identified a problem if you didn't have Chaos Monkey running. I would personally argue that like that really depends on the maturity of your organization and like the capability of doing that, right? Like I wouldn't run chaos like a thing like Chaos Monkey if I had one server supporting the entirety of my application and there's no redundancy. There's really not any point to that, right? So as far as whether you should run test recoveries inside production or a separate disaster recovery environment, run them in both, right? But like where you can, and I don't think that you should be doing it in prod nearly as often, right? Like, you know, if you're doing your tests every quarter, okay, do it bi-yearly in production, right? But like test every quarter in the disaster recovery environment. But also run it according to what your playbook actually is. I think that's far more important, right? So like if your playbook is, if we get breached and we need to restore from backups get restored in the disaster recovery environment, then test them in the disaster recovery environment. But if they get restored directly to prod, test them in prod. That's really dependent on your environment itself and what your org's processes are.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So, you know, Jonathan, you've talked about a lot of changes, that organizations, might consider making. Buy-in can be a challenge that you run into when trying to implement changes. How do you get buy-in in your experience?
So I love this question, right? Because like, to my mind, the core purpose of information security within any organization is to just mitigate risk. With that in mind, you have to be able to demonstrate the risk trade-off of not doing these actions when you're trying to get buy-in, right? Like risk to a business is literally just dollars, right? As security, we are a cost center to the business, but we can offset that cost center by reducing risk, which ultimately saves dollars in the longer term, right? So if your goal is to mitigate risk, you should be communicating why the organization should be investing in mitigating that risk. One of the best ways to do that is by demonstrating it, right? Going back to like my previous point, conduct offensive exercises. That's a fantastic way to just get buy-in, because it's like, hey, I've been telling you that this could happen, this could happen, this could happen, and it's like, okay, yeah, whatever, we'll deal with that later, or it's not a priority. But then it's like, I'm showing you that this will happen in the event that a breach happens. Like, this is what an attacker will do, and this is the effect that it will have on us. This is the risk that you are taking on by not, providing resources in order to mitigate this risk. That's one of the best ways to kind of argue and formulate your point, as far as like trying to get buy-in. But going back to Mika Zenko's book, I remember there's a great point in it about like being the adversarial punching bag, if you will, right? There's a key to balancing, always being the person that says this could go wrong, and like, being annoying is the best way I could possibly say that. Where it's like, if you're always playing the devil's advocate, people don't necessarily always like that. So it really depends on like who the audience that you're communicating it to is. But from communicating it to the business itself, I always try to explain that messaging in the terms of what the business cares about. And at the end of the day, as business, that's mostly about dollars. So like if you can translate risk to value, that's one of the best ways to do it.
Super. Hey, it looks like we're running out of time, but Jonathan, if somebody wants to get started with ReliaQuest or find out more, what do you recommend?
I recommend you reach out to our Contact Us page on reliaquest.com. Just visit the website, hit Contact Us, and we'd be more than happy to help you get started. You can check out some of our resources here.
Yeah, what do we got here? It's reliaquest.com solutions, ransomware.
Yeah. So we have a lot of white papers and blog posts related to the topic of ransomware, right? Like ransomware is one of the biggest things that our customer base, is worried about, deals with. So there's a lot of resources that we have available, to talk about that. And like, this is one of the most, core things that we've been focusing on trying to mitigate. So, there's a lot of our resources are available on that link.
All right. Excellent. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for putting together this presentation and for all your insights here in the Q&A too. Like I said, as we started the Q&A, the presentation was fantastic. I know I was writing furiously, taking notes, and I'm sure the audience was too. So really appreciate your time today. Thanks for bringing us up to speed on ReliaQuest.
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and with that, we finally, it's time for the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the gift card today is Jorge Pita from Texas. So congratulations to Jorge. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank ReliaQuest for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all of your great questions today. Just a fantastic number of questions that really drove the discussion. That's always the best part of these events, and we really appreciate your engagement. So that concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.